Have you ever trusted someone so completely, only to discover they were betraying you with someone younger? This is not just a story of infidelity. It's a story of how betrayal turns into karma and how silence can be the most brutal revenge of all. Today on Cheating Stories 7, we'll uncover the dramatic fall of a marriage that seemed perfect but crumbled under the weight of lies. Stay until the end because the twist in this story will leave you speechless. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Cheating Stories 7 for more gripping tales. Now, let's step into today's story. She betrayed me with a younger man, but karma made her beg for mercy. The small blue house on the corner never made the news, but people slowed down when they passed it. There were tomatoes climbing a trellis by the porch, a wind chime that sang when the hill caught a breeze, and 2 coffee mugs that always dried upside down on the rack by the sink. Daniel Carter left for job sites before sunrise most days. He would tap the thermostat up 2 degrees for Melissa, leave a note about the dog Walker, and pocket the tape measure he kept forgetting to return to his toolbox. Melissa woke to the smell of coffee and the soft thud of his steel-toe boots at the door. She liked the way his presence made the house feel anchored. She liked the way he said her name in the morning, low and half asleep. On weekends, they moved as a team. He patched drywall or tinkered with a wobbly cabinet door while she planned meals for the week and labeled jars with painter's tape. Family called them reliable. Friends said they were proof that love could be ordinary and still be enough. 9 years together had made them efficient. 3 years married had made them confident. When they argued, it was usually about small things. He left screws in a bowl beside the bed. She forgot to run the dishwasher before a Monday. They were good at apologizing and better at moving on. It should have felt like safety. At first, it did. Melissa loved the ritual of taking Daniel's shirts off the line and pressing the collars smooth. She loved the short drive to her office near the river and the way the morning light slid down the glass. She loved how Daniel listened when she described a new client and how he said, "Sounds complicated," with a smile that meant, "I believe you can do it." She loved that their plans were simple. A bigger deck next spring, a dog that did not shed, a trip to Santa Fe when the savings jar was finally full. But somewhere in the quiet between winter and spring, the rituals kept moving while something inside her stalled. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no slammed door. Melissa only noticed it in the kitchen one Tuesday when she set down 2 plates of pasta and realized Daniel was still on a call about permits. The food cooled while he paced the hallway and she told herself it was fine. Everyone gets busy. He touched her shoulder as he walked past and she felt both seen and not seen at all. It became a pattern. Daniel's work stretched later. He took on weekend shifts to help a buddy meet a deadline. He answered emails with his plate balanced on one knee. When she told him about a podcast she loved, he nodded and asked if she had seen his level. When she came home with a new haircut, he said, "Looks nice," and reached for his boots. There was no malice in it. He was a good man who wanted to provide. He believed loyalty sounded like showing up to work and paying the mortgage on time. He believed love looked like a roof that did not leak and tires that did not bald. Melissa tried to name what she was missing and could only come up with small words. She wanted surprise. She wanted a kiss that interrupted a task. She wanted him to ask, "How did your meeting go?" and then wait for the answer. She wanted to feel chosen on an ordinary day. She understood that marriage could not be fireworks every week. She did not want fireworks. She wanted a match struck in a dark room, the soft bloom of light that said, "I am here and I am looking at you." She told herself to be grateful. Gratitude worked for a while. She made lists in her phone. Roof paid, fridge full, partner faithful. On Saturday, she watched Daniel hand a neighbor a ladder and thought, "This is who he is," and she loved him for it. On Sundays, she scrolled old photos from the first apartment and remembered how he used to press his smile into her hair when they were both too tired to speak. Memory made her tender. The present made her restless. The house itself began to mirror the change. Little things went unremarked. The basil on the sill wilted and never quite recovered. A birthday card sat half-written on the hall table because Daniel's job site ran long and the dinner with friends got postponed. She waited up for him and fell asleep on the couch with the lamp on. He draped a blanket over her and stood for a moment to watch her breathe, then went to rinse the grit from his hands. In the morning, she woke to the faint smell of lumber and missed the question that would have cracked her open. "Are you happy?" She wanted him to ask and feared the answer. When Melissa laughed at work, it startled her. It rang in her chest like a sound from another room. She was not unhappy, she told herself. She had a life people envied, but envy is thin paper. It hides, it muffles, it tears when you press a finger through it. She did not want to tear anything. She loved her husband. She loved their life. She just wanted something to light inside her again, a glance that warmed, a sentence that landed, the simplest proof that desire had not been packed into a closet with the winter coats. On a Thursday in late May, Daniel texted that he would be late because a crane had malfunctioned and the crew needed him. Melissa ate alone and washed a single plate. She stood in the doorway of their bedroom, looking at the dent his body left on his side of the mattress, and tried to remember the last time he had crossed the space between them without prompting. The question rose and she pushed it down. This is a season. Work will calm. We will find our way back. She believed it because she needed to. She believed it because love had carried them this far and because the alternative felt like walking to the edge of a map. Outside, the wind chime answered a gust. Inside, the clock over the stove ticked through another hour. The house waited the way houses do, collecting the echoes of a life and storing them in corners. Melissa brushed her teeth, turned off the lamp, and laid her palm on the empty sheet beside her. Tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow he would notice. Tomorrow she would not feel invisible in a life she chose. Tomorrow is a generous word. It makes room for hope. It also makes room for everything that can go wrong. Melissa's office sat on the 8th floor of a glass tower overlooking the Colorado River in Austin. Most mornings she arrived with her coffee half finished and her mind still weighed down by the silence of home. Her desk was always neat, color-coded files, reports stacked perfectly, but her heart felt anything but orderly. She was used to Daniel's calm predictability, his quiet nods when she spoke about work. What she wasn't used to was being noticed. That notice came on a Monday in late June. Ryan Brooks, 23, a marketing intern fresh from college, walked into the bullpen with a kind of energy that turned heads immediately. He was tall, loose-shouldered, with a quick smile and a confidence that bordered on reckless. While most interns introduced themselves timidly, Ryan shook hands as if he belonged already. He landed at the desk across from Melissa's, and when he grinned, it was bright enough to feel like a spotlight. At first, it was harmless. Ryan asked for help with campaign data, cracked jokes about the bitter office coffee, and rolled his sleeves as though even the air conditioning couldn't cool him. Melissa answered politely, telling herself he was just being friendly. But the way his eyes lingered a beat too long stirred something inside her, a reminder that she was a woman still worth looking at. The compliments began almost casually. "You've got the sharpest mind in this office," he said when she solved a client puzzle. Another day when she wore a red dress, he murmured, "That color suits you, it makes you glow." No one had told her she glowed in years. Daniel usually said, "Looks nice," then went back to his emails. Ryan's words were reckless sparks, and though guilt pricked her, she let them land. Lunch invitations followed. First with colleagues in a group, then just the two of them at the cafe across the street. They laughed about trivial things, bad jingles, clumsy clients, her story about spilling coffee on a pitch deck. He listened, really listened, leaning forward as though every detail mattered. Daniel used to do that years ago. Melissa left those lunches lighter, almost giddy, even as she reminded herself constantly, "I'm married. This is just work." But boundaries blurred quickly. Texts shifted from professional to personal. Ryan sent memes at night, then good morning messages before sunrise. Melissa caught herself checking her phone at odd hours, anticipating his name lighting up the screen. The thrill was intoxicating, a secret pulse running through her routine. With every message, guilt deepened, but so did the hunger. Melissa tried to push back. She told Ryan he was too young, that she was married, that this needed to stop. He only smiled, unbothered. "I know," he said, "but you deserve more than just routine, don't you?" His words echoed the ache she had buried under chores and deadlines. Dangerous words, words she could not unhear. When Ryan brushed her hand while passing a file, she didn't pull away quickly enough. When he lingered by her desk after hours, she didn't ask him to leave. She told herself it was nothing, but inside she felt the first strands of loyalty to Daniel snapping one by one. Walking home, Melissa replayed the day in her head. Daniel would ask about dinner, about whether the car needed gas. Ryan asked about her favorite movie, her childhood dreams, the book she once loved in college. One man was her husband, safe and steady. The other was temptation itself, a mirror reflecting the woman she feared she had stopped being. By the end of the month, Melissa realized she was waiting for Ryan's attention the way plants wait for sunlight. She still cooked dinner for Daniel, still folded his shirts, still shared his bed, but her mind was already elsewhere. And though she whispered to herself that she loved her husband, a shadow of doubt had crept in. Was love enough if she felt invisible inside it? Melissa knew she was playing with fire. She could smell the smoke already, yet she did not step back. Because for the first time in years, she felt alive. And that dangerous feeling would soon demand a price far greater than she could ever imagine. The invitation came on a Thursday evening, slipped between Ryan's usual banter and his careless grin. "You've been carrying the whole team this week," he said, leaning against Melissa's desk with his tie already loosened. "Let me buy you a drink, just one. You deserve it." Melissa hesitated. She had promised herself that lunches were as far as it would go, that dinners and late nights belonged to Daniel. But Ryan's charm was disarming, and she was tired of being the woman who always said no. One harmless drink, she thought, just one. The bar was dimly lit, the kind of place where no one asked questions and everyone looked like they belonged to someone else's story. Melissa sipped her wine while Ryan teased her about her serious work voice, about the way her brows furrowed when she read reports. She laughed more freely than she expected, her voice rising above the low hum of conversation. The weight of her routine slipped from her shoulders, replaced by something reckless, intoxicating. When Ryan brushed a strand of hair from her face, Melissa's breath caught. She should have pulled away, should have reminded him and herself of the ring on her finger. But she froze, caught in the intensity of his gaze. The kiss came quickly, inevitable after weeks of lingering touches and whispered compliments. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, then deepened into something hungry. By the time she pulled away, her heart was pounding with both thrill and dread. That night, Melissa didn't drive home. She texted Daniel that a project had run late and collapsed into a hotel bed that smelled of cologne and betrayal. Guilt gnawed at her in the morning, but Ryan's voice drowned it out. "Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you." Melissa told herself it was a mistake, a one-time lapse in judgment. Yet when Ryan suggested meeting again, she didn't refuse. Soon their secret meetings became routine, hurried embraces after work, stolen hours in quiet corners, messages that kept her phone buzzing long after midnight. Every kiss carried guilt. Every touch reminded her of Daniel's trust, of the life they had built together. But guilt tangled itself with exhilaration, and exhilaration always won. She rationalized, "I'm still a good wife. I cook, I clean, I smile at family gatherings. Daniel doesn't need to know." Well, this doesn't change anything, but it did. It changed everything. Lies slipped too easily from her lips. She invented meetings, fabricated deadlines, claimed traffic jams that never happened. Each excuse was another stone added to the wall rising silently between her and her husband. Daniel, exhausted from long hours at the construction site, never saw the wall being built. He still kissed her goodnight, still trusted her completely. One evening he reached for her hand on the couch and she flinched as though burned. He didn't notice. He was too busy telling her about a new project, his voice steady, his future still intertwined with hers. Melissa nodded, her thoughts already drifting elsewhere. She told herself she could stop at any time, that she was in control, that it was just a spark to remind her she was alive, But with each meeting, the spark grew into a fire and stopping seemed impossible. She was no longer choosing between right and wrong. She was surrendering to a hunger that had already taken root. And Daniel, devoted, loyal Daniel, remained blind to the truth. He dreamed of expanding their home, of a future built brick by brick. Melissa, meanwhile, was dismantling their foundation one secret at a time. She thought she could live in two worlds. But each day the distance between them narrowed, and when those worlds finally collided, nothing would be left standing. The weeks blurred into a double life. By day, Melissa remained the efficient marketing coordinator. The woman who arrived early, filed her reports neatly, and went home to her husband each evening. But in the hidden hours, she became someone else entirely. A woman who silenced her notifications, slipped out of the office with her pulse racing, and rehearsed excuses before stepping through her own front door. She learned how to delete messages without hesitation, how to change her phone password twice in a single month, how to glance over her shoulder every time she laughed too loudly at a text. Ryan didn't make it easier. He was reckless, sending her late-night pictures from his apartment, voice notes that whispered her name, even clips of them together. The first time he suggested recording one of their encounters, Melissa froze. "It's crazy, Ryan, we can't." But his grin was cocky, his arm heavy around her waist. "It's just for us, a memory no one will ever see." Against her better judgment, she agreed, and afterward she hated herself for not saying no, yet she never deleted the file either. At home, Daniel remained blissfully unaware. He was working longer hours than ever, chasing a contract that would help them finally afford the down payment on a larger house. He came home tired but hopeful, talking about extra square footage, about a backyard with space for a swing set, even though they hadn't spoken seriously about children in years. Melissa would nod, smile, pretend to listen. Inside, guilt coiled tighter with every word. The house itself felt different now. Where there had once been shared laughter and comfortable silence, there was an invisible divide. Melissa answered Daniel's questions with vague phrases, "just a busy day," or "nothing important." She made love to him less often, claiming deadlines or headaches, and when she did, her body was present but her mind flickered with images she could never confess. Daniel noticed the distance but mistook it for stress. "You've been working too hard," he said one night, rubbing her shoulders as she sat stiff at the kitchen table. "We'll get through this season. Things will calm down." He kissed the top of her head and went back to his emails, never suspecting that the storm was already inside their walls. Melissa dreaded those moments of kindness most. A cup of tea left by her laptop, a text asking if she had gotten home safely. Each gesture pierced her like a blade. They reminded her of what she was betraying, of how undeserved his love truly was. More than once she thought of confessing, imagined blurting out the truth just to end the charade. But the words stuck in her throat. She wanted both worlds, the safety of Daniel's devotion and the rush of Ryan's attention. Ryan, for his part, thrived on the danger. He teased her for being the married one, called her my secret with a wink that thrilled and terrified her. When she tried to slow things down, he only laughed. "You can't quit me, Melissa. I see it in your eyes." And he wasn't wrong. Every time she swore it was the last time, she found herself back in his arms within days. The affair stretched from weeks into months. Seasons shifted, the basil on the windowsill shriveled. Daniel replaced the tires on her car, summer heat gave way to autumn chill. And still Melissa played the role of loyal wife while living as a stranger to herself. Each morning she buttoned her blouse, slipped on her wedding ring, and prayed no one would see through her polished smile. The irony was merciless. Daniel was saving, sacrificing, building a future brick by brick. And Melissa, in shadows and lies, was tearing it all down. The home that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a stage, its walls echoing with unspoken truths. And though she knew the risk grew sharper with each passing day, she couldn't bring herself to stop, because in the shadows of her guilt, the thrill still burned. And that flame was bright enough to blind her to the devastation waiting just ahead. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind of night that should have passed without consequence. Daniel was rummaging through the kitchen drawer looking for a charger. Melissa often left her phone there when she came home. He picked it up absent-mindedly to move it aside, and the screen lit up. A notification appeared, an unfamiliar file-sharing app, one Melissa had never mentioned. Daniel had never been the type to snoop. Trust had been the foundation of their marriage, the reason he never questioned late nights or unexplained sighs. But the alert blinked insistently, as if daring him to look. His thumb hovered. Then, with a breath he didn't realize he was holding, he tapped once. A folder opened. Inside, just a single thumbnail, blurry but unmistakable, Melissa's face, her hair, her body entangled with someone else's. Daniel froze. His throat went dry, his pulse hammered in his ears. For a long moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Almost mechanically, he pressed play. The video filled the screen, and there was no denying it now. Melissa, his wife of 9 years, laughing softly into the ear of a younger man. Ryan, the intern, their bodies together in ways that should have belonged only to him. He lasted less than a minute before shutting it off, but the damage was complete. His chest felt hollow, as though the ground had been scooped out from beneath him. With shaking hands, he copied the file to his own phone, not because he wanted to relive the nightmare, but because he needed proof. Proof that what he had seen was real. Proof that his life was not built on paranoia, but on betrayal. When Melissa called later, her voice was light, casual. "Are you almost home? Should I start dinner?" Daniel stared at the kitchen wall that suddenly felt like a prison. He forced words through the tightness in his throat. "I'm staying at Marcus's tonight. His cousin, his safe place." Her tone sharpened instantly. "Why? What's wrong?" Daniel could have unleashed everything right then. He could have screamed the truth into the phone, shattered her with the rage boiling inside him. Instead, he chose silence. His voice was flat, hollow. "I just can't come home." And before she could ask more, he hung up. An hour later, while Melissa flooded his phone with frantic texts, "Are you okay? Did I do something? Please answer me." Daniel attached the file and pressed send. No words, no explanations, just the raw image of her betrayal. It was all the conversation they needed. Melissa's world collapsed in an instant. The moment she saw the video, her breath left her body. She pressed play once, then again, as if denial might somehow change the images on the screen. But there she was exposed, her secret affair laid bare by her own carelessness. The phone slipped from her trembling hands, and she covered her face, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She called Daniel immediately. He didn't answer. She called again, and again, her messages spiraling into desperation. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, please let me explain. It meant nothing. Please don't leave me." But his silence was impenetrable, louder than any rage could have been. Daniel sat in Marcus's guest room, staring at the ceiling. The betrayal replayed in endless loops. He thought of the mornings he rose early to make her coffee, the nights he worked overtime so they could save for a bigger house, the laughter they once shared in their first apartment. Every memory was poisoned now, twisted into evidence of a love he thought was safe but had already been rotting. Trust, he realized, doesn't die slowly. It doesn't fade over years. It shatters violently in a single instant, and once broken, the shards cut everything they touch. Melissa spent that night pacing the living room, her body trembling. She thought of driving to Marcus's house, of throwing herself at Daniel's feet to beg. But fear rooted her in place. The image of him watching the video, his eyes cold, his jaw clenched, was unbearable. She knew she had lost something she could never win back. By morning, the house felt like a mausoleum. The silence pressed down like stone. Melissa collapsed beside their bed, clutching Daniel's pillow as though it could bring him back. Her tears soaked the fabric, but nothing could wash away the truth. For Daniel, the video turned 9 years of memories into ashes. For Melissa, it was a mirror she could never shatter. The moment she saw, with cruel clarity, the price of her betrayal. Daniel had always been a man of measured words. He believed shouting rarely solved anything, that silence could often say more than anger ever could. But this silence was different. It was heavy, deliberate, final, like the sound of a door slamming in the middle of the night. Melissa discovered its weight almost immediately. After receiving the video, she spent hours flooding Daniel's phone with apologies, promises, frantic pleas. Each message grew more desperate than the last. It was a mistake. I love you, only you. Please talk to me. But her screen remained cold, unread notifications piling up like tombstones of a marriage she had buried herself. Daniel, meanwhile, unpacked his bag in Marcus's guest room. His cousin didn't press for details. One look at Daniel's hollow eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, was enough. Marcus offered only a blanket, a nod, and the gift of silence. Daniel lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, every memory of his marriage replaying like a cruel film reel. Where had the lies begun? How long had he been blind? Melissa couldn't bear the distance. On the second day, she drove to Marcus's house, her face streaked with tears, her fists pounding on the door until Marcus's wife opened it. Please, Melissa begged, her voice raw. I just need to see him. Let me explain. Daniel appeared in the hallway. His shoulders were rigid, his face pale from sleepless nights. For a heartbeat, Melissa thought she saw recognition in his eyes, the faint memory of love. She tried to rush forward, but his voice, flat, sharp, final, stopped her cold. Don't. The single word struck harder than any scream. Melissa crumbled to her knees, sobbing. Daniel, please, it was a mistake. I can change. I'll do anything. Her voice broke into pieces, echoing through the entryway, but Daniel only shook his head. His silence wasn't weakness, it was a shield, the only way he could protect himself from the woman he no longer recognized. Marcus stepped between them, guiding Melissa gently but firmly back onto the porch. She clawed at the doorframe, her cries growing louder, but the door closed anyway. The sound of the latch clicking shut hollowed her chest. She drove home in a fog. The walls mocked her with their familiarity, every picture frame now a reminder of what she had destroyed. She scrolled through old wedding photos, their vacations, their smiles. Daniel's warmth in those images felt like a ghost, something she could see but never touch again. For Daniel, silence became survival. He couldn't bear to hear her voice begging for forgiveness when every memory of her lips was poisoned by betrayal. So he ignored the calls, muted the messages, and buried himself in work. Each hammer strike, each lifted beam became a release of the rage he refused to waste on her. But for Melissa, the silence grew unbearable. At night, she lay on his side of the bed, inhaling the fading scent of him on the pillow, whispering prayers into the darkness. The fear that once lingered as a shadow now became her reality. She wasn't just losing her husband. She was losing her anchor, her family, her future. Silence, she realized, could be louder than any scream. And in Daniel's silence, she finally heard the truth, clearer than if he had shouted it in her face. Their marriage was no longer a safe harbor. It was a shipwreck, and she was drowning in the wreckage. The Carter family had always been close-knit, the kind of clan that celebrated everything together, birthdays, promotions, even small home renovations. That Saturday evening was no different. Daniel's cousin Marcus hosted a backyard gathering, fairy lights strung between the trees, barbecue smoke curling into the air, the hum of conversation rising like a tide. Daniel arrived alone. Outwardly, he looked composed, his handshake firm, his smile faint but polite. But in his chest, the weight of betrayal pressed like iron. He drifted toward the edge of the yard with a glass of whiskey, the laughter around him sounding foreign, as though joy belonged to another world. Melissa had heard about the gathering through Marcus's wife. Desperation, more than courage, carried her there. She convinced herself that if she could just look Daniel in the eyes, if he could see her pain, maybe something in him would soften. Her knuckles whitened around the steering wheel as she drove. By the time she stepped into the yard, her chest was tight with fear and fragile hope. Heads turned the moment she entered. Melissa, once admired as the steady, devoted wife, now carried the invisible stain of scandal. Conversations faltered. Some people looked away in pity, others whispered behind their hands. She ignored them all, her gaze locked only on Daniel. He was seated by himself, the porch light casting long shadows across his face, exhaustion carved deep into his features. Melissa's knees trembled as she approached. The chatter around them dulled until she could hear nothing but the frantic rhythm of her own heartbeat. Daniel, her voice cracked. She sank to her knees in front of him, clutching his leg, her tears spilling freely. "Please, I'm begging you, forgive me. I made a mistake, but I love you. Don't throw us away." For the first time in days, Daniel looked at her. His eyes were hollow, stripped of the warmth that once lived there. He studied her as if she were a stranger who had wandered into his life wearing his wife's face. The silence stretched, unbearable. Melissa clung tighter, her sobs breaking into fragments, but Daniel didn't move to comfort her. He didn't curse her or raise his voice. Instead, he stood. The scrape of the chair against the wooden deck was louder than any accusation. And then, without a glance backward, he walked past her. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Murmurs rippled through the air like judgment whispered by the wind. Melissa reached for him, but he never turned. That absence, his refusal even to acknowledge her, cut deeper than any insult. It was as though she no longer existed. She crumpled on the ground, her cries echoing through the yard. Someone whispered, "How could she?" Another voice said, "I never thought Melissa would be that kind of woman." Each word was a stone hurled at her already shattered pride. Daniel disappeared into the house, leaving Melissa exposed, a spectacle beneath the fairy lights. Marcus's wife tried to lift her gently, murmuring for her to go home. But Melissa clung to the porch rail, shaking her head violently. She had come to reclaim her place at Daniel's side, and instead she had been stripped of her dignity in front of everyone who once respected her. The night continued as though nothing had happened. The barbecue smoke still hung in the air. The laughter eventually returned, cautious at first, then louder. But for Melissa, the world had ended in that yard. By the time she stumbled back to her car, mascara streaked down her face. She understood the depth of her exile. She wasn't just losing Daniel. She was losing the family, the community, the identity she had once built so carefully. Now she was only one thing, the woman who had betrayed Daniel Carter. And the world would never let her forget it. Melissa could not let go. After the humiliation at the family gathering, her desperation only grew sharper. Daniel's silence was unbearable, the distance between them now an ocean she could not cross. On the third night, she convinced herself that if she confronted him face to face, if he could see her brokenness, maybe, just maybe, he would let her back into his life. She drove to Marcus's house without calling, fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The porch light glowed faintly, shadows moving inside. Her chest hammered with rehearsed apologies. "Daniel, please, I can't live without you. I'll do anything." But when the door opened, the sight inside stole the breath from her lungs. Daniel was seated on the couch, and beside him was Claire Hudson. Claire, her old college acquaintance, a woman who had lingered quietly on the edges of their social circle for years. Dependable, steady, harmless, or so Melissa had always believed. Now Claire sat close to Daniel, her body angled toward his, her expression calm and steady as if she belonged there. Melissa's voice cracked. "Claire?" Claire rose smoothly, unshaken. She placed a hand lightly on Daniel's shoulder before stepping forward. "Yes, me." Her tone was level, her gaze unwavering. Daniel deserves someone who respects him, someone who sees him for the man he truly is. The words sliced through Melissa's chest. Her knees weakened, fury rising to replace the hollow fear. "You think you're that person? You think you can just step into my marriage?" Her voice rose, jagged and raw, pulling Marcus and his wife from the kitchen. Daniel didn't move. He didn't defend Melissa, nor did he defend Claire. He sat in silence, watching, his face impassive, his body still. That absence of reaction, the refusal to fight, was more unbearable than rage. Claire tilted her head, her calmness cutting like glass. "He's been hurting, Melissa, and you're the one who did this to him. Don't blame me for standing where you abandoned him." Melissa's hands trembled as she pointed, her words breaking into sobs. "You've wanted this for years, haven't you? I saw the way you looked at him." Claire didn't deny it. She let out a soft laugh, not cruel but confident. "Yes, I admired him because he's a good man, the kind you threw away for a thrill with a boy who never deserved you." The room tightened with silence. Melissa spun toward Daniel, her eyes wild, her tears burning. "Say something. Tell her she's wrong. Tell her you don't want her." But Daniel didn't speak. He lifted his glass, took a slow sip, and set it down again. The message was clear. His silence was an answer louder than words. Melissa lunged forward, rage flooding her voice. "You won't replace me." Marcus stepped in quickly, his hands gripping her arms to hold her back. Her sobs tore through the room as she fought against him, while Claire stood composed, chin lifted, unflinching. "Melissa," Claire said quietly, firmly, "you lost him long before I stepped in. You lost him the moment you betrayed him." Daniel finally rose, brushing past Melissa without a word. The brush of his shoulder as he passed felt like rejection carved into flesh. He disappeared down the hallway, leaving her gasping, pinned between Marcus's grip and Claire's unwavering gaze. Melissa stumbled out onto the porch, the night air striking her damp cheeks. Behind her, the house glowed with warmth, voices low but steady. She was outside now, banished, unwanted, irrelevant. Jealousy consumed her. But beneath the fury was a truth far more terrifying. Daniel no longer needed her tears, her explanations, or even her presence. The love she had squandered was gone, and it would never return. Melissa's fury, stoked by humiliation and jealousy, finally erupted the moment she saw Claire still seated comfortably near Daniel. All the unanswered calls, the silence, the public rejection, they all burst out at once like a dam breaking. Without thinking, Melissa lunged forward. Her hand shot out toward Claire's hair, but Marcus caught her wrist midair, his voice sharp. "Enough, Melissa." Claire rose slowly, calm as stone. Her composure was gasoline on Melissa's fire. "You think clawing at me will fix what you broke?" Her voice was steady, cutting. "He doesn't want you. He hasn't wanted you for a long time." "Shut up," Melissa screamed, straining against Marcus's grip, tears spilling down her face. "You don't know us. He's my husband. He belongs with me." Claire smirked faintly, her arms crossing. "No, Melissa, he belonged to you, past tense, but you gave him away the day you chose someone else's bed." The words sliced through the air. Brutal, unarguable. Melissa's knees buckled, her sobs filling the living room. She dropped to the floor, reaching for Daniel. Her voice was cracked, desperate. "Please, Daniel, look at me. I made a mistake, but I still love you. Don't do this to us." For a heartbeat, something flickered in Daniel's eyes, the ghost of the man who once adored her. But just as quickly, it vanished. He turned his gaze away, his jaw set like stone. Without a word, he walked toward the door. The sound of it closing echoed like a verdict. Melissa collapsed fully to the ground, her palms flat against the floorboards, her cries raw and animalistic. Marcus bent down, torn between sympathy and anger, trying to lift her up. But Claire's voice cut through the chaos. "Look at yourself," she said coldly. "Begging on the floor won't change anything. You've lost him. You'll never get him back." Melissa's sobs twisted into wails, her entire body shaking. The humiliation was complete. Not only had she lost her husband, she had lost her dignity in front of everyone who mattered. By the next morning, the story spread like wildfire through family and friends. People whispered about how Melissa had thrown herself at Daniel's feet, how she had tried to attack Claire, how she had been dragged away screaming. Once the admired wife, she was now a spectacle, a cautionary tale of betrayal and downfall. Melissa sat alone in her house, her phone buzzing with messages she couldn't bring herself to read. Some feigned sympathy, others judged openly. But the unspoken truth in every word was the same. She had become a disgrace. Instead of winning Daniel back, she had pushed him further away. Instead of regaining her pride, she had shattered it. And as Daniel's silence stretched on, Melissa realized something far more devastating. She hadn't just lost her husband. She had lost her place in the world they had built together. What remained was only a hollow stage, and she was left to play the villain in her own tragedy. The front door clicked shut behind her with a hollow thud, and Melissa stood frozen in the entryway of the house that had once been her sanctuary. It felt unfamiliar now, as if she were trespassing in someone else's home. The faint trace of Daniel's cologne lingered in the air, haunting her senses, making her chest ache with a grief too heavy to hold. She dropped her purse onto the counter and let her eyes sweep across the kitchen. The room was spotless, eerily spotless. Daniel's coffee mug, usually left near the sink, was gone. His lunchbox, his work boots by the back door, the jacket slung casually on a chair, all of it absent. The silence was suffocating, pressing against her ears until she thought she might scream. Melissa slid to the floor, her back pressed against the cabinet doors. Memories rose like ghosts around her. Daniel's arms slipping around her waist while she stirred sauce on the stove. His laughter when she spilled flour across the counter. The way he leaned against the fridge just to watch her move. Now the space was barren, stripped of warmth. Every echo reminded her that he wasn't coming back. When night fell, she crawled into their bed and clutched his pillow to her chest. The sheets were cold, the indentation of his body already fading. She whispered into the darkness as though the walls could carry her words to him. "I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I need you." But the house answered only with silence. Days bled into one another. Melissa drifted through rooms like a ghost, existing but not living. She sat at the dining table, staring at untouched meals. She scrolled through her phone with trembling hands, rereading Daniel's old messages just to feel the illusion of his presence. Friends stopped calling. Family kept their distance. The social circle that once revolved around their marriage now orbited around Daniel alone, leaving her stranded outside. Her loneliness became unbearable. She left lights on in every room to fight the crushing quiet. Even then, the emptiness swallowed her whole. One evening, she played their wedding song, desperate for comfort, but the melody turned cruel. Each note mocked her with memories of vows she had broken. Her reflection frightened her. Hollow eyes swollen from crying, skin pale, shoulders slumped. She no longer recognized the woman staring back. She wasn't the admired wife, the woman envied at gatherings. She was a shell hollowed out by regret. She tried calling Daniel again, once, twice, 20 times. Each unanswered ring was another nail hammered into the coffin of her marriage. Eventually, she stopped, not because she accepted the loss, but because the rejection hurt more than silence itself. The house that once pulsed with life, laughter over late-night movies, whispered conversations under blankets, the rhythm of two people sharing space, was now nothing but a mausoleum of memory. Melissa wandered its halls, haunted by ghosts only she could see, and for the first time she truly understood the depth of what she had destroyed. Not just her marriage, not just Daniel's trust, but the very meaning of home. The walls could still stand, the roof could still hold, but without him it wasn't home anymore. It was only an empty shell, and she was its prisoner. Daniel had avoided Melissa for weeks, burying himself in long hours at work and the quiet refuge of Marcus's guest room. But silence, no matter how heavy, cannot last forever. There comes a point when avoidance must turn into decision. And on a gray Saturday morning, beneath clouds swollen with rain, Daniel reached that point. He agreed to meet Melissa at a small park near their old apartment, the place where they had once walked hand in hand, dreaming of futures that now felt like fantasies. Melissa arrived first. Her eyes were swollen from sleepless nights, her fingers twisting around the wedding ring she still clung to. She looked smaller than before, diminished like a shadow of the woman he once thought he knew. When Daniel approached, her body jolted as though she had been thrown a lifeline across stormy waters. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice already breaking. She reached for his arm, but he stepped back. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. The memories tried to surface. The first date, the vows, the mornings filled with laughter. But each memory drowned beneath the image of that video, seared into his mind like a scar that would never fade. Finally, his voice cut through the silence, steady and cold. "We're getting a divorce." The words hit Melissa harder than any scream. She gasped, clutching at his sleeve as though she could hold the world together by sheer force. "No, please. Don't say that. I made a mistake, Daniel, but we can fix this. I'll change. I swear to you I'll be better." Daniel pulled free of her grip, his jaw tightened, his eyes unyielding. "Melissa, it ended the moment I saw that video. You understand? Everything we built, every promise, every memory died that day. There's nothing left to fix." Her knees gave out and she fell to the damp grass. "Don't do this. I'll cut him out of my life. I'll never see Ryan again. Just give me one more chance, please." Daniel's gaze didn't soften. If anything, his voice grew sharper. "Go to him. That's who you chose. You don't get to come back now that you see what you've lost." His words were knives, each syllable deliberate. Melissa clutched the hem of his coat, her sobs echoing through the park. Passers-by slowed, their faces tight with discomfort, but Daniel didn't care. Her shame was hers to bear. "I love you," she whispered desperately, her voice shredded by grief. "I never stopped loving you." Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath heavy with finality. "If this is love, Melissa, I don't want it." Then he turned. His footsteps were steady, each one pulling him further from the wreckage she had created. Melissa stayed on the ground, her cries carrying into the empty park, but he never looked back. He had looked back for too long already. For Daniel, the decision was not born from anger, but from clarity. He had spent sleepless nights wondering if forgiveness was possible, if trust could be rebuilt. But the truth was unshakable. Trust, once shattered, could never return to what it was. The man he had been, the man who believed in Melissa without hesitation, no longer existed. As rain began to fall, Melissa curled into herself on the wet grass, realizing that Daniel's resolve was unbreakable. Divorce was not a threat. It was not a bargaining chip. It was a reality carved in stone. And in that moment, she finally understood the weight of her choices. There was no path back to the life she had destroyed. The door was closed, the key thrown away. Daniel had walked on, and he would never return. News spreads quickly in tight-knit circles, and in Austin, the Carters had always been admired as a couple worth envying. When whispers of Melissa's affair began, they traveled faster than wildfire, from dinner tables to church pews, from neighborhood sidewalks to office corridors. At first, Melissa told herself people couldn't possibly know the details, but the looks confirmed otherwise. People knew enough. It started with silence. Her sister-in-law stopped returning her calls. Friends who once invited her to brunch now had other plans. Even at work, colleagues lowered their voices when she passed. Fragments of their hushed conversations floated through the air. "It's true with that young intern. How could she do that to Daniel?" Her parents called once, their voices heavy with disappointment. "We raised you better than this," her mother said, trembling with both anger and shame. Melissa tried to defend herself, but every word fell flat. Nothing she said could erase the image already fixed in their minds. Eventually, even her family pulled back, leaving her adrift. Meanwhile, Daniel became the quiet hero in their story. Friends praised his dignity, the way he chose silence over scandal. Neighbors dropped by Marcus's house to check on him, offering sympathy, admiration, and support. Invitations flowed his way, with Melissa's name conspicuously absent. Where once she had been included in every gathering, she was now erased, replaced by whispers and pity. The shift cut deepest in the most ordinary places. At the grocery store, Melissa used to walk the aisles with ease, exchanging smiles and greetings. Now heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. A mother pulled her child closer as though betrayal were contagious. Melissa kept her gaze down, clutching her basket, humiliation burning in her chest. One afternoon near the produce section, she overheard two women speaking too loudly to be coincidence. She had everything, a loyal husband, a good life, and she threw it away for a fling with a boy. The other woman sighed. Some people don't know what they have until it's gone. Melissa abandoned her cart and fled, tears blurring her vision as she stumbled into the parking lot. At night, the weight of judgment was unbearable. The phone that once buzzed with calls and texts now sat in silence. Social media, once filled with cheerful updates, had become a gallery of absences. Daniel smiling with friends, surrounded by support while she was nowhere to be seen. Posts she tried to make gathered dust, ignored as though the world itself had turned its back on her. The judgment became a cage. Every time she stepped outside, she imagined eyes on her back, whispers slipping from behind curtains. Shame pressed against her like chains, until she hardly dared to leave the house at all. What cut deepest wasn't just the loss of respect. It was that Daniel had gained even more of it. He was painted as the wronged husband, stoic, resilient, admired, while she was cast as the villain. And perhaps she thought bitterly that was exactly what she had become. Melissa lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the words of Daniel echoing in her head. "We're getting a divorce." She finally understood it wasn't just the end of her marriage. It was the end of her place in a family, in a community, in the very life she had built. She hadn't simply lost Daniel. She had lost herself. Melissa could not accept silence as an answer. Every morning she reached for her phone, sending message after message, her fingers trembling as she typed. "Please talk to me. I'll change, I promise. Don't throw everything away." Each message delivered, but none received a reply. The small gray check marks on her screen became daggers, reminders that Daniel was reading her pleas and choosing not to respond. When texts failed, she turned to paper. She wrote letters by hand, filling pages with apologies, memories, promises. She slipped them under Marcus's door, sometimes pressing them into Claire's hand with a desperate whisper, "Please give this to him." Weeks later, Melissa saw some of those envelopes stacked neatly on the entryway table, unopened. Desperation turned to obsession. She drove past Marcus's house at night, slowing down just to catch a glimpse of Daniel's truck. Once she saw it parked beside Claire's car, and the sight nearly stole the air from her lungs. The thought of Daniel finding comfort, even laughter, in another woman's presence drove her into panic. One evening she knocked on the door, her tears spilling, her voice breaking as Marcus answered. "Please, I just need to see him." Marcus's expression was firm, almost pitying. "Go home, Melissa. He doesn't want to see you." The door closed, leaving her sobbing on the porch. At work, she drafted long emails during lunch breaks, recounting their happiest years, picnics in Zilker Park, lazy Sunday mornings with burnt pancakes, the vows they exchanged under a Texas sunset. She hoped reminding him of their love might soften his heart, but each email went unanswered, swallowed by silence, and that silence became unbearable. Daniel's refusal to scream, to argue, to even curse her name, his refusal to acknowledge her existence, was a punishment more brutal than rage. In his quiet, she felt erased. Every time he lowered his eyes instead of meeting hers, she heard the verdict louder than any words. "You no longer exist in my life." Meanwhile, Daniel grew lighter. He attended family gatherings again, shoulders less burdened, his laughter returning in small, measured doses. And when Claire was near, people noticed the ease between them, the way she caught his dry humor, the way his posture softened in her presence. They didn't flaunt anything, but their quiet closeness was undeniable. And for Melissa, it was torture. Her world shrank further. She paced the empty rooms of her house, clutching her phone, waiting for a message that would never come. Nights were the worst. Alone in their bed, she replayed every mistake, whispering apologies into the dark as though words alone could reach him. One final attempt came on a cold evening. She waited outside Marcus's gate, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. When Daniel returned from work, she rushed forward, collapsing to her knees on the gravel. "Please, Daniel, just tell me what to do, tell me how to fix this." For a moment he paused. Melissa thought she saw hesitation in his eyes, but then he shook his head slowly, his face unreadable, and walked past her without a word. The door closed behind him, silent and final. Melissa remained on the driveway, sobbing into her hands, and in that moment she finally understood his silence wasn't hesitation. His silence was the answer. For Daniel, silence meant freedom. For Melissa, it became a life sentence of regret. The house was quiet now, so quiet Melissa could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of pipes in the walls. Once this home had been alive with laughter and footsteps, the clatter of dishes, whispered conversations in the dark. Now it was a shell, a museum of memories that refused to fade. Melissa sat at the edge of their bed, her hands tangled in the sheets, inhaling deeply as if the fabric still carried his scent. Her mind wandered back to Ryan's smile, the reckless grin that once felt like excitement, like freedom. But now that same smile haunted her as something cruel, mocking, the spark that ignited her downfall. She tried to remember why it had ever seemed worth it, why a fling with a younger man felt more valuable than the steady devotion of her husband. No answer came, only shame. Her thoughts circled back again and again to the night everything shattered. The text message from Daniel, the attached video that gutted her world in an instant. The way her body shook as she dropped the phone, sobbing on the bathroom floor. She remembered dialing his number, begging him to pick up, but hearing only silence. That silence stretched into days, then weeks, until it became permanent. Melissa pressed her palms against her face, whispering into the emptiness. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Daniel." But there was no one left to hear. The man she had betrayed had walked away, carrying with him not just his love, but the very foundation of her existence. And Daniel had not simply left. He had begun to rebuild. She knew it, through the whispers of others, through glimpses of him at gatherings. They said he looked healthier now, lighter, as if a great burden had lifted. They mentioned Claire's name too, careful but smiling, hinting at a companionship that was steady, genuine. Every word was another knife twisting deeper. Melissa drifted through the rooms of the house like a ghost. The dining table where Daniel once pulled out her chair. The hallway where they argued over small things and kissed it away. The sofa where they fell asleep watching old movies. Each space whispered of a life destroyed by her own hands. Karma had come for her not with fury but with absence. It wasn't Daniel's anger that crushed her. It wasn't the judgment of family or the sting of Ryan's betrayal. It was the silence. Daniel's silence had hollowed her out more completely than any words could have. On a rainy evening, Melissa stood by the window, her reflection blurred by streaks of water sliding down the glass. Her face looked older, her eyes dim, her spirit drained. She whispered into the storm, confessing to no one. "He loved me with everything he had, and I threw it away." Her voice cracked, the words dissolving into sobs. She finally understood. There was no undoing, no second chance. Regret had come too late, and forgiveness would never follow. Melissa curled up on the couch, clutching a framed photo from their wedding day. Daniel's smile in the picture was radiant, filled with faith in a future that would never exist. She rocked gently, tears soaking the glass. And in that moment, the cruelest truth revealed itself. The harshest punishment wasn't Daniel's anger, nor Ryan's betrayal, nor the judgment of a community that had cast her out. It was knowing she had lost the one man who loved her completely, and that he was never coming back. Karma had spoken, and its voice was silence. And that brings us to the end of today's story. She betrayed me with a younger man, but karma made her beg for mercy. In the end, Melissa learned the hard way that betrayal doesn't just destroy trust, it destroys everything around it. Sometimes revenge doesn't come in shouts or anger. Sometimes it comes in silence, and silence can be the most devastating punishment of all. What about you? If you were in Daniel's shoes, would you have forgiven or walked away just like he did? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Cheating Stories 7 for more dramatic tales of betrayal, revenge, and karma. Until next time, thank you for watching.